So we're going to do these techniques. If you're at home, you might not have all this stuff, but I'm just going to demonstrate it so that you can see how it works. Watercolor, like nice quality watercolor, it can dry out forever in your palette, and as soon as you add water to it again, it like reactivates the paint and makes it usable again. So I have some watercolor palettes from college that are like 20 years old, and they're still fine. So before you start, if you have a palette that's like this that's dry, just drop a little bit of water on each color, and that starts to loosen it up and get it ready for painting. It feels really different to use the dry watercolor versus something that comes straight out of the tube. And I'll show you both. This is the stuff that's in the palettes. This is a nice quality watercolor. And if you squeeze it out, it looks kind of like acrylic paint. It's thick like that, but you don't want to use it thick. If you're going to do a thick painting, use acrylic paint. This stuff is it's really expensive for little bottles, but that more importantly, like that's not the way that watercolor is used. So typically, you add water to it when it's the dry little bump of color that you added stuff to. You might have to squish your brush around on it a lot to get the color saturation that you want. But when it first comes out of the tube and it's fresh and it's wet, you have to be a little bit more careful about how much water you add to it, because otherwise it can turn it into kind of a mushy mess. So I'm going to show you first the first one, flat wash with this orange that was dry, and then I'll do the graded wash with the red one that was wet. I'm not sure if I can zoom this for you at home. If I touch something, it's going to mess up my phone. Yeah, no. Sorry, I'm trying to zoom, but it doesn't really work. So hopefully you can see that. A flat wash just refers to an even application of color. So really it's as simple as getting color on your brush and then brushing it across the square. It does take a little practice though to get even color without any like gradations or changes in value. As you can see how right here my brush stroke left a little bit of a lighter area, and I don't want that on a flat wash. So it just takes practice to get the right consistency of paint. Like it's too dry down there. And get everything even. If you go over it too many times, it can start to affect the value. So yeah, practice. Some people like to work with 2 water cups because you'll use one for cleaning your brush and then one for actually painting, and then the water's not dirty when you paint. I just have one for the sake of room on my table. But okay, so flat wash is even. A graded wash or a gradation is I'm going to do dark to light, and I'm going to use this wet watercolor that I just squeezed out of the tube. When you just squeeze it out of the tube, the best way to use it is to get water on your brush first, and then touch it just to the edge of like that puddle of color. If you work from the edge of it, you can control how much color you're pulling out. So if you wanted it really, really saturated, you pull more and more of the watercolor. But you're still controlling how much actual paint you're using. If you just stuck your brush into this wet color, you would have way too much, and it would be gloppy, and it wouldn't work like watercolor anymore. So for the graded wash, I'm going to take a pretty saturated color with a lot of the pigment, and then paint a stripe of it at the top. And you have to work kind of quickly for this technique. I'm going to rinse off my brush and add water right under it before it dries. If you have room on your paper, you can continue rinsing your brush and adding fresh water. And it draws the color down into the water, so you can see how it's darker up here and then it gets lighter as it goes down. And it's not going to be perfect because when watercolor mixes with either other color or with water, it does kind of this like swirly kind of stuff that you can control a little bit, but not completely. But that's kind of the beautiful thing about watercolor. The accidental marks that it makes. I'm going to go pretty fast. I usually go slower and fast when everybody's following along, but if y'all who are doing this with me need help with a certain one, I'll come back and show you again. So wet on wet, this technique, it's just a description of a technique, so this could apply to acrylic paint or oil paint or watercolor paint, but it just means that you're mixing your colors together while both colors are still wet. So I'm going to mix, I don't have a very nice selection on my palette right here. I'm going to get some yellow real quick, and I'll mix red and yellow. When you're mixing color, it's best to start with the light color and add the darker one to it because you have more control over the color that you're creating. If I started with this red and kept trying to add yellow and yellow and yellow and yellow to it, you end up with a huge puddle of color, and it's really hard to lighten something. It's much easier to get something darker. So I'm going to take some of the yellow color over here first. And I'm just going to add a little bit of red. Really, though, I want to show you the wet on wet color mixing on the paper. So I'm putting some yellow here, and then while it's still wet, I'm going to switch over to get some red and let those mix. And you can kind of go back and forth between your colors. More or less water will do different things. But it's making orange, but it's mixing the orange on the paper rather than mixing it first in the palette. And so it gives you this way of color mixing gives you more variation in the color. Like you get different kinds of oranges without trying real hard. But if you wanted one consistent orange, you would mix it in your palette first and then paint it on. I like this. It just depends on what you're painting. Glazing is also applies to all types of painting, but it's when you put transparent color over something else that's already there, and you can see through the transparent color, and it does like this optical mix. I can show you what I'm talking about. So here I have the background of yellow, and I put green over it and red and some blue, and you can see the green color here, but it looks different. Oh, yeah, but it looks different when it's over the yellow. Like it's a different color on the white than it is on the yellow. Same with this one. It's different on the yellow. And you can glaze multiple things. This one requires the bottom layer to be dry before you can do the glazing. So on this one, I'm just going to paint some yellow again, and then I'll come back to it later once it's dry. So I'll just do a flat wash of color. And I'll come back to that. The next one is Scumbling or dry brush. Both names refer to the same thing. It is a dry brush. So it means that you're putting some color on the brush, but you're not using a ton of water. Like right now, I have lots of water on here, so it would give me a nice, call it, this is a term for watercolor, juicy color. This one up here has really juicy color, but this Scumbling and dry brush, I'm going to actually dry the brush off on a paper towel. I have color on it, but not super wet. And then Scumbling is kind of just like, I have it too wet still. Hang on. Scumbling, you kind of move your brush around in different ways, and you get a darker color that you can see better. And it gives you more like scratchy kind of marks rather than a solid saturated color. Here's an example of it. So you might see the texture of the paper coming through with dry brush. This paper that we have is pretty smooth, so you don't see that, but some watercolor paper is rough, and so like if you were doing rocks or mountains or something, you could use a dry brush on top, maybe on top of another color that's already there, and it would hit the peaks of the paper and make kind of interesting textures. And play around too with like how you're holding the brush, whether you're using the very tip of it or the side of it. The side gives you kind of some interesting marks for dry brush. Dropping in color is just another descriptor of what I'm doing in this one. So first I'm going to paint some, make sure I'm doing this right, on the right square. I'm going to paint just some clear water on the paper. If you kind of tilt your head, you can look and see a sheen on the paper, so you can kind of see where you've put your water, depending on the lighting that you're using. But dropping in color just means that you're putting some color on the brush and then touching the tip of the brush to the water that you just put down, and you can see how it starts to spread out and make like blooms of color. And then the cool thing about this technique, you can even move your paper a little bit, like tilt it a little. You don't want to do too much if you have a lot of paper on there, because then you'll get drips. But the color will only go to the borders of what you painted the water, or the shape of the water that you painted on there. And it kind of stops when the paper becomes dry. So you could use this technique to purposefully fill in like a small shape or area that you want color in if you don't want any color around it. You can also drop in color to existing color instead of just water. So kind of a combination of the wet on wet technique and dropping. And put some yellow here. And then get some of this red on my brush and just like touch the end of the brush to it. And it'll start to spread out and cool variations on the color. The next one is lifting, and that refers to having some paint there and then purposefully taking some away to make lighter areas of color. With watercolor, there's no white paint. So if you want a white area or a lighter area, you have to reserve the white of the paper to act as your white, or you can lift the paint. But once it's there, like once I'm going to use green, you can't get it back to pure white. So if you wanted like feathers on a swan's back, you would paint the rest of it. I'll show you both on this one. I'll just do a feather. Like say I want a white feather, I would paint the negative space around it, but I wouldn't paint the feather. So watercolor takes a little bit more planning than acrylic or oil paint. And then once I have it there, if I wanted to do the lifting technique, I've got all the color off my brush, and I'm going to dry it as much as possible on a paper towel. This works while it's still wet. I'm going to put the brush down and let it sit there for a minute because it's absorbing the color and the water, and then lift it back up. And pull this up a little bit. It lightened the green right there, but it didn't bring it back to pure white. If your paint is more dry, I did that pretty quickly, so the paint was still wet and I was able to lift a lot of it. But if your paint dries, then just get your brush a little bit more wet first, and then let it sit there maybe a little bit longer, because that'll loosen up the paint that's on the paper. It'll like reactivate that watercolor paint if it's dry, and then you can lift it up. But it doesn't work as well. It works best if the paint is still wet. So it's harder to fix mistakes with watercolor. Usually, rather than trying to erase, I would just work around it and like maybe paint something else there or increase the value rather than taking it away. Maybe make the outside of this part a little bit more defined. You can also lift with other things besides your brush. I'm going to show you a technique for clouds on this one, but it's essentially the same thing. Where instead of the brush, you would use toilet paper or something absorbent, paper towel. Coffee filters work well. show you that one in a minute. The next one is feather. Oh, not funny. I drew a feather. I wasn't doing that on purpose. It's my subconscious speaking. Feathering just means that you have the color here, and then you want to soften out the edges. So if it's kind of a harder line, but you want to soften maybe the side of it. It's easy to do while it's still wet. It's kind of the same as a graded wash. So I've got my color rinsed off. I'm taking some of the moisture off because if it's too much, it's just going to like spread everywhere. But then I'm touching the brush to the top of that line to just kind of soften it. You know, I made two squares. It's kind of the same thing as this soft edge, or the idea of the soft edge. And if you wanted it more feathered than that, add a little bit more water to the edge that you made. I guess it's just more of a controlled gradation than this graded wash technique that I showed you. You can also kind of take the color and touching the end of the brush to the red and then draw it down a little bit and kind of scrub as you go. And that can feather some stuff out too. Bring this up a little bit closer. Okay, next one is a wipeout technique using Kleenex or toilet paper. This one is good for clouds. Let me get a little blue. The sky doesn't have to be blue, but mine's white. I just squeezed this out of the tube, so just a reminder, I'm going to get my brush wet and then work from the edge of that little blob of color so that I can control how blue I get, how intense my blue is. Okay, and this one, you do have to work kind of quickly, so you want to get the toilet paper ready beforehand, actually. I'm going to take a little piece of toilet paper and crinkle it up so that it has good like ridges and divots. And I'm going to stamp this into the wet paint. So, ready for action. If you're doing a sky, you want your paint to be more wet for this to work the best. More of the wet on wet technique rather than the dry brush or scumbling. But while it's still wet, then you place the toilet paper gently. If you stamp it too hard, it'll just make a big white blob. If you kind of touch it to the paint, but not too hard, and then let it sit there for a few seconds, and then pull it off gently, you'll get like variations of the blue that kind of look like clouds. So you can do that, and then move your toilet paper around to a clean side if you wanted to do more. Sometimes that's exactly what you're looking for. Like if I wanted very subtle clouds, those look pretty subtle. But if it wasn't dramatic enough, you can also go back in and add some more color back. I'm just going to go back and forth with it. Show you what I mean. So all of these techniques, of course, can be combined. What I'm doing right now is it's the lifting technique. It's the wet on wet, essentially, because this blue paint is still wet. I'm putting more blue on it, but it's still kind of feathering out. I'm doing that to emphasize the cloud shapes that I made kind of accidentally. But now my lines look a little too harsh, so while it's still wet, I'm going to do the feathering technique on the edges of it, of the extra blue marks that I made. All this stuff takes practice. Watercolor is pretty tricky to deal with when you're first starting. So if it doesn't work for you right away, keep trying. It's one of my favorite media. Okay, hard edge. This is going to be similar. Some of my squares are pretty similar, rectangles. Hard edge is really similar to masking. This is called masking tape, right? I think you're familiar with that word. The reason it's called masking tape is this, that you put it down on your paper to mask or to reserve the white of the paper. So like right here where I painted around the feather to keep the feather white, with masking, you can actually make like a little feather shape out of tape. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but you could make a shape, put it down, and that keeps your white white. So for the hard edge, a good way to get it means that it's really straight and really precise, and it's not feathered like that. It's hard. So to do that, I'm going to put down some masking tape. The edge of the tape right here is going to become my hard edge. This is blue painter's tape, and it's the best one to use because it's least likely to damage your paper, but it's still sticky enough that it really doesn't allow the paint to seep back under it, usually. So I'm going to take my paint and paint it up here, all the way to the edge of that tape. Oh, I shouldn't use blue. Same color as the tape. And then I'm going to let that dry before I take the tape away. If you take it off too soon, this paint can leak down into the area that we've just reserved. So even though it's fun to peel the paint off or the tape off, leave it there until it's dry. Go back and look at it. The soft edge really is similar to feathering. Typically, we do that without any kind of masking. And I'm just going to draw a line here to show you the difference between the hard edge and the soft edge once I take this paint off. The tape off. Scratching is exactly what it sounds like. It's a good technique for feathers. Feathers, fur or grass. That's what I meant to say. These brushes in particular, the ones that I have a beveled end, and that's specifically for this technique. The scratching technique is you're scratching the paint around, and it makes pretty interesting marks. Do that. I'm going to start with pretty juicy color. Do green like grass. And this one you have to work pretty quickly because you want your paint to be real wet. Once you get color down there, then take the end of your brush and just kind of like flick it up. And it does two things. It removes some of the paint down here, kind of like the lifting technique. So some of the marks here get a little bit lighter than what's around it. And then it also draws the paint up into the negative space that was up here. In this case, it's the white of the paper, but you may want to do this on top of like a sky that you've already painted. It's always good to do your backgrounds first, because if you're going to do this technique for grass, but you hadn't done the background yet, then you would be trying to like fill in the color around these cool little marks, and it wouldn't look as nice anymore. It would be hard to get around all the little details. You can also just scratch into it, not to make the grass texture, but just to do kind of the lifting sort of technique. But it gives you different types of marks than if you were doing it with sorry, that's not in focus. Focus it. Sorry, different marks than if you were doing it with a soft brush, because now you're using the hard end of the brush. Ooh, I didn't get any cement. But I do have a plastic bag. This next one is, I put saran wrap on there. I forgot to grab some, but I have just a plastic grocery bag works too. This needs to be thin plastic. piece. You want the paint to be pretty juicy. This is another one that requires drying time, but I can show you my other example. While the paint is still really wet, sprinkle up your saran wrap or plastic, just like with the toilet paper, and just set it on there. Again, not pressing too hard because you don't want to just smush it and make it into nothing. Ooh, I think the saran wrap does work a little better because it lays flatter. I'm going to actually tape this down a little bit. I like it when things don't work, and you can figure out new ways of doing stuff. We'll see. This is an experiment. I don't know if that taped on HEB bag is going to work very well, but cross your fingers. I'll show you this one. I've gotten it to work better than this before. This isn't the greatest example, but it makes interesting marks when it dries because it'll pull some of the paint into more saturated areas, and then some of it will be lighter. So it gives you like interesting, strange marks. Usually there's more kind of lines and crisscrosses in it. We'll check that one later. Let's try it and see how it works. We're getting into like the cool techniques with props, like salt. This is just regular table salt. You can use rock salt too, the bigger stuff. It makes bigger marks. So for this one, this takes practice in like figuring out your consistency of paint. There has to be just the right ratio of paint to water and just the right amount of moisture for it to work beautifully. And if it's in like one kind of proportion, your marks from the salt will be really big. If it's a little different, they'll be smaller. So this one in particular takes a lot of experimenting to get it right. Just do the stuff you want to do. You want it to be pretty wet, but not big puddles. If the puddles are too big, it'll melt the salt and not do anything. But if it's not wet enough, it also won't do anything. I'm dropping the salt right onto the wet paint. And what the salt does, it's a desiccant. It'll suck the moisture out of the paper. And when it does that, it leaves behind these little starburst kind of marks. It's really pretty, but it takes a while for that to form. It has to dry and absorb and do all that kind of on its own. I might not have had my paper wet enough because it looks like my starbursts aren't very big and beautiful, but I have some other examples where they worked really well. And this one worked okay. You can see some of the marks are bigger here. That's where the paint was more wet, and then where it was drier over here, it made kind of more like speckles up here. It's more dramatic on a larger surface too. You just have these tiny little rectangles. These are watercolor pencils, one of my favorite things in the world. They're basically watercolor paint in a pencil form. But just like I said, the blobs of paint can dry on your palette forever and still become paint once they get wet. That's what this is. It's just watercolor paint that's in a pencil form. So it's great for little details or for doing an underpainting. I'm going to show you more on the watercolor pencil section. But this sandpaper and watercolor technique is like a tricky little thing. Got sandpaper, watercolor pencil, and then I'm going to put some yellow watercolor down and keep it pretty wet. And while that's still wet, I'm sanding the watercolor paper onto it, kind of like a cheese grater. You're grating cheese, so it puts these little speckles of the watercolor paint really onto this. And because the paint underneath the yellow was wet, it loosens up the little speckles and turns it into paint, and they'll start to spread. It spreads more if I could have this a little more wet on Really small speckles if the paper's kind of dry. If it's more wet, there'll be larger blooms of color. There we go. That one's a little difficult to see, I think, on the screen. And now I don't want to move it too much because I made this really wet, and now if I move my paper, it'll run and make drips all over the place. I guess I don't really care because it's an example, but just know that you have to be kind of careful when you're transporting your paintings if you don't want drips. Ooh, I might be able to finish all of these in one shot. Next one's water blooms. Another tricky technique kind of thing. Let's see. I'm going to use blue because I think it'll show up well. Put the paint down. And then ideally you would have nice clean water. Mine's getting gross because I'm washing my brush in it. But with your clean water, once your paint is there, drop just water on it. Or you can flick it on by like using your wrist and doing this. Or if you want more control, I like to put out my finger and then like tap the brush on it. Well, I didn't do a splatter one. I usually do that. That's a technique too. You can splatter your paint that way as well. The water blooms, when the water hits it, it pushes the paint away, and it makes. It makes lighter marks where the water is dissolving the paint more, making it lighter and more transparent, and then pushing it out. It's just kind of like interesting moments. Isopropyl alcohol is rubbing alcohol. Hand sanitizer works too. We tried an experiment last year. It's the same thing, but it's more dramatic. It does a more dramatic splatter than just water by itself would. I'm just going to drip a little bit on, but you can also dip your brush into the alcohol, a clean brush, make sure it's clean, and a little cup of alcohol. Oh, that one looked cool. Did you see? So the alcohol is really pushing the pigment away and making a big full mark. My paper was maybe a little too wet, so I don't know where it's going to stop. It's still expanding. But it's making pretty interesting marks and like a good variation in value, darks and lights. I know I'm going really fast. The next one's watercolor pencils, so I just want to show you how they work. This sandpaper and watercolor pencil is like a specialty, tricky technique thing, but typically you use watercolor pencils just like regular pencils first and do like your underpainting or your drawing or whatever. I guess there are two ways to use it. I'll show you both. You can layer the colors. So I'm like making a new kind of red-violet by using this red on top of this violet. The harder you draw first and like the more pigment that you lay down with these, the darker your paint will be. Once you finish your drawing, then with clean water, again, mine is all gross and green now, but with clean water on your brush, then you go over what you've drawn and it reactivates that paint, melts it, and turns it into more of a painting. So it has more of a painting look than a drawing look. And it's again a matter of practice to see like how much moisture you want on your brush, whether you want a lot and it really melts out your color, or whether you want it relatively dry and you have more control over what marks you turn watery and what ones you might want to choose to keep like sketchy. The other way to use watercolor pencil is to go over things that are already there and add details. So I'm going to use this one that is already finished. I did on this grass section. So say I wanted to add a little bit more variation in the darks of this grass, I could take a purple pencil. Don't be afraid to use unexpected colors. There could be purple in the grass. So I'm going in between these little blades of grass to darken up the value with the pencil. And then you don't have to like melt out everything, but you can here and there a little bit. I kind of like some of the texture that the pencil made, but I also want it to have a sense of unity and look like the technique belongs with this painting. Watercolor pencils are also good if you want to sketch out your painting first, but you don't want pencil lines to show through. With watercolor, if you did a great little sketch, I'll do one then, and you wanted this to be like, you wanted to paint this little flower shaped thing, but you wanted to draw it first to like plan everything out. If I paint this with pencil underneath, I'm going to see the paint lines. If I did it with a watercolor pencil, you can still get the basis of your drawing down. You can kind of erase them. It doesn't erase completely, but you can certainly lighten the lines. This one's graphite, that one's watercolor pencil. Then I'm going to paint them. With graphite, the water almost intensifies the graphite and makes your lines more obvious. Sometimes you want that look. It's not a bad thing if it's intentional. But you definitely can still see the outlines of it. I'll bring this up closer in a minute. But with the watercolor pencil, when you go to do your paint, it also kind of melts your line. And if you wanted it to be completely invisible, you could use a lighter, like do your drawing with yellow. I didn't. I used red, so it's making kind of a red outline. If I was painting my flower red, you wouldn't see it at all. And you could also just touch water to it and not even add more paint in some areas. I don't know if you can see that very well, but that's the difference between having a pencil drawing underneath and a watercolor pencil drawing. Watercolor disappears. Yeah. For sure. I like the idea of combining techniques and having different things going on even in the same piece. That's a little visual interest. Rubber cement, I don't have any. I thought I had some in my box, but let me just show you what it does. You paint the rubber cement on. I painted it here in a circle. And then let it dry completely. And then once it's dry, you paint over it. And what it does is it blocks whatever area it was painted on, and the paint doesn't go there. Then you let all that dry, and then you can peel off the rubber cement. It's just there temporarily, but it leaves whatever shape you painted it on. It's a little difficult to work with because it's gooey and goopy, and it's also toxic, so that's why I don't usually have it in the classroom. But if you use it, you can do it outside. There's also something called masking fluid that I grabbed. I have some, but it looks like it dried over the summer. I'll try and get some out. This does have latex in it, so if anybody has a latex allergy, don't use it. Oh, it might be good. I'm going to use a pencil to apply it. This stuff, once it gets on anything, it's gooey forever. So if you put it on with your brush, it would ruin your brush. I have a Q-tip. It's best to use something disposable, or the back of a brush works okay. I don't know if this is going to work very well because it's like separated and weird from the summer. I guess I could shake it up. So rubber cement or masking fluid is the same thing, but I'll have to come back to this once it's dry. Yes, it comes off after it's dry. This one is pink, and it's just colored so that you can see where you put it. So yeah, I'll show you that whole technique. Sorry, I forgot that I had prepped this. The next one, masking, it's the same idea, it's the same premise. It's just a different material to do it with, which I kind of did up here with the hard edge. You can use masking tape to create a barrier and mask or reserve the white space. And if you want it to be a thing, like rather than just straight lines, you can cut your tape. Grab an X-Acto knife. You can cut it directly on your paper. You just have to be careful that you don't cut into your paper. So it takes some practice because you want to cut the tape, but just the width of the tape. Alternately, you could cut this on a different surface and then transfer it to your paper. Let's say I wanted to do like a weird little squiggle shape. My X-Acto knife blade is kind of dull. Cut a shape, and then I'm using the end of the knife to flip up like an edge of this tape so I can peel it off. Oh yeah, and I had 2 layers of tape right here, and so I didn't get through all of it. So overlapped my tape. You'd be a lot more careful than I'm being right now because I'm just doing a quick demo. My X-Acto knife blade is dull. Not working as well as it should. But I cut a little hole right there. You can also cut out a shape and then lay it on the paper. Pretend this is like a cute little bird or something. So you can either do the negative mask, where I cut away, or the positive, where I put it down. And then paint on top. That has to dry. Take the paint off. You can probably take it off from the hard edge. Let's try that over. That's pretty good. When you're peeling tape, it's best to peel it at an angle, so it looks kind of like a triangle shape. That's the safest way to do it to avoid damaging your paper. So you can see as I'm taking this off how nice and straight and perfect that edge is because I masked it with the tape. Versus the soft edge where I just used a brush. And they both have their place. If you're doing like buildings and it was going to be a perfectly straight, hard edge, you might use the masking. If you're doing a tree where you're kind of indicating the edges of it, then you might use the soft edge. Okay. Oh, I forgot that I left myself a square for underpainting with watercolor pencil. I already did it. It's right here. I guess I'll just point out too that, like, really, if you're doing something for a larger piece that's going to have multiple colors, I like to use a lighter neutral colored watercolor pencil. This one's good. It kind of looks like a yellow ochre kind of color. So, another feather. So then when I paint that, the drawing part will go away. I'll just finish painting it without adding any more color. I kind of like that look too. If you don't use too much water, you can kind of just paint over your lines and it softens them, but leaves the marks there. So now it looks like paint, but you can still really clearly see the drawing that was underneath. I guess not clearly on the projector. I promise you can see it in real life. And then I left these rectangles down here for mixed media. Watercolor works well with pretty much anything. So once it's dry, you could add Sharpie marker or pen. Looks really nice on top of watercolor, especially if you're trying to like tighten up details or if you're doing something that's in kind of a comic style. Sharpies and pens work great. You can use charcoal, you can use pastel, oil pastel, you can put acrylic paint on top of it. There isn't really anything you can't put on top of it. Oil paint, you would have to put gesso down first, but that's a whole other conversation. So I kind of just gave myself these rectangles to play around with. But usually you want it to dry first. I guess there are things though that you can add while it's wet that do interesting stuff. Oh, if you draw into wet paint with a watercolor pencil, it can do kind of interesting things. It intensifies the color quite a lot. So what was a lighter red mark before is now really pretty saturated red, and then the edges are soft. Ooh, there's such a thing as watercolor or water-soluble graphite. It's like a pencil that turns into watercolor. I'm gonna grab one real quick. It's one of my favorite things. This is a water-soluble graphite stick or graphite bran. It's a huge chunk of graphite. It's the same stuff that's, well, it's not exactly the same. It's similar to what's in your pencil, except it's huge. And this one, the brand is Lyra, is water-soluble. So that means you can do your drawing first. The darker mark you make in the beginning, the darker you paint. And then it's just like watercolor pencil by water afterward. But it has more the look of a pencil, more like that gray of a pencil. We all know and love. Ballpoint pen works great. Works better if it's completely dry. This is completely dry yet. So then the last ones to go back to are glazing. See another one? It's the ceramic and salt. With glazing, really the only thing to keep in mind is that the more water you add to your paint, the more transparent it gets. And so you'll be able to see through it if it's more transparent to the color that's behind it. If I just put really thick blue paint on top, see, you wouldn't really see a whole lot of difference. But if I thin down the paint and do a transparent wash on top, it's probably difficult to see on the projector, but they mix, they're not physically mixed together. It's like one layer on top of the other one, but you're looking through it, so it optically mixes the color for you, and it looks green. It's blue when it's on the white paper, and then green on top of yellow. And you can do that multiple times, so once this is dry, I can go back on top of it with something else, like hair texture or something. But it shows you the value and kind of the color shifts underneath. The salt, once it's dry, I don't think I have my paint quite wet enough, but once it's dry, you would just brush it off, and then you should be able to see the salt texture. And then same thing with the saran wrap. I don't think this has been sitting here long enough, but let's see. Oh, actually, that looks kind of cool. You can see it. I can bring this back and show you. It makes some interesting marks. So stuff like that, all the tricky stuff with watercolor is great for backgrounds. And then you do that first and then come back in and do your actual painting on top of it. It gives it some texture and interesting things in the background. This masking fluid actually is kind of dry, so I'm going to go ahead and do that one too. So I'm painting directly on top. This stuff is, it feels like rubber if you touch it, because it is, it's latex. Ooh, it's Halloween time. I bet latex makeup would work too. I'm not sure though. So I painted the yellow all over the place. It still looks pink where the masking fluid was because it doesn't stick to that. So ideally you would let that dry, let your yellow paint dry. And then once it's dry, you can peel off the masking fluid. I'm just gonna like kind of rub it with my finger. I'm doing this early just for the purposes of a demo, but if you want your nice crisp edges, wait for it to dry. See, it's like stretchy and kind of weird, latexy, but it kept that white of the paper. The masking fluid is really good if you have tiny, fine little details that you want to keep white, like if you were doing little glimmers on the water or something and you wanted little specks that are pure white and you don't want to paint around all those little specks, then that would be a good thing to use. Okay, did I miss anything? The fastest watercolor demo ever. Oh, masking. There's the masking with tape where I cut a piece out and where I put a positive piece of tape on. All right, that's it.